The door didn't break the way they expected. It held for half a second longer. Long enough. The first man from Yamam was already inside the fatal funnel when the hinge tore loose. The charge had been calculated for reinforced steel, not a warped apartment frame swollen from humidity and neglect. The blast displaced the door unevenly. It twisted instead of flying. A mistake measured in centimeters. Inside, the corridor was narrower than the blueprint suggested. Civilian modification. Unauthorized walls. A refrigerator where there shouldn't have been one. The point man adjusted, but the second operator didn't see the angle shift. A shot came from the left. Not blind. Not panicked. Deliberate. 7.62 millimeter. Close range. The sound compressed by concrete walls into something heavier than it should have been. The team didn't return fire immediately. They paused. Not from hesitation. From recognition. This wasn't a barricaded suspect reacting late. This was someone waiting at the exact breach point. Outside, the command vehicle was already receiving fragmented audio through encrypted police band comms. The on-site Yamam commander, a superintendent operating under Israeli Border Police Authority, didn't speak. He listened. The transmission was clipped. Breathing. Movement. One word in Hebrew. Shifted. That was enough. Inside, the stack broke formation. Not retreating. Recalculating angles in a space that no longer matched their entry model. The hallway temperature was over 30 degrees Celsius. No airflow. Sweat interfering with grip. Gloves tightening around suppressed rifles. Another shot. Higher this time. Not aimed at center mass. A warning. Or control. They had planned for a hostage rescue. High-speed urban response. Immediate dominance. That was the doctrine. But the man inside wasn't reacting to pressure. He was shaping it. 2 floors below, local patrol units had already sealed the perimeter. Civilian density still high. Evening traffic. No full evacuation. Time was constrained by politics, not tactics. Above them, a police helicopter held position but could not deploy illumination without exposing the assault geometry through the windows. Everything was compressed. Distance. Time. Information. Inside the apartment, the unknown gunman didn't move again. And that was the first real problem. Because Yamam was built for speed. And speed only works when the other side is slower. They had already run the scenario 3 times before the breach. Same. Building. Same entrance. Same assumptions. A mid-level apartment block on the edge of a dense urban grid. Concrete construction from the late 1980s. Narrow stairwells. Limited sightlines. Civilian families on every floor. No structural blueprints beyond outdated municipal records. The kind of place Yamam had cleared dozens of times before. The target was categorized as a high-risk armed suspect. Not a network. Not an organization. 1 man. Possibly 2. That classification shaped everything. The intelligence package came from a fusion of Shin Bet internal security reporting and Israeli police surveillance logs. Signals intelligence had flagged irregular phone activity routed through prepaid devices. Short calls. Under 30 seconds. Repeated patterns. But nothing sustained. No chatter. No coordination. Human intelligence was thinner. A local informant reported weapons inside the apartment. Kalashnikov platform. Possibly a handgun. No mention of training. No mention of prior combat experience. That detail never made it into the operational briefing. Because it didn't exist. The Yamam assault element was structured into a standard 4-man entry team, reinforced by a secondary containment unit positioned on the stairwell below. Each operator carried a suppressed M4 platform with short barrels optimized for close quarters, holographic sights calibrated for low-light engagements. Sidearms were standard-issue Glock 17s. Flashbangs staged, but not deployed in the initial breach due to suspected hostage proximity. The assumption was control. Fast entry. Overwhelming force. Immediate compliance. They had done it before. In Lod. In Hebron. In the outskirts of Jerusalem. Different layouts. Same outcome. The chain of command was clear. Tactical control rested with the on-site Yamam commander. Strategic oversight remained with Israeli Border Police Headquarters, with Shin Bet maintaining intelligence authority. If escalation occurred, authorization for lethal force was already pre-approved under counter-terror protocol. No delays expected. At 1940 local time, surveillance units confirmed the target's presence inside the apartment. Thermal imaging from an elevated adjacent structure showed one heat signature moving intermittently between 2 rooms. No visible hostages. No secondary movement. That reinforced the assumption. Single hostile. At 20:05, the outer perimeter was established. Local police units redirected traffic, but could not fully clear civilians. The building remained partially occupied. Lights on in multiple apartments. Television flicker visible through windows. The environment was active, but manageable. At 2017, the Yamam team began ascent. No elevator use. Too predictable. They moved on foot, ascending 3 floors in under 40 seconds, controlling noise through staggered foot placement. Each man knew his sector. Rear security covering the stairwell. Front element already visualizing the breach. They stopped outside the door. No sound from inside. That was noted, but not questioned. Because silence was expected, the breaching charge was placed low, near the locking mechanism. Measured. Calculated. Enough to break resistance without excessive fragmentation. Civilian structure. Thin walls. Overpressure had to be controlled. At 2019, the command was given. Detonation. And then everything began to misalign. The door didn't open cleanly. It twisted. Shifted on impact. The entry angle changed by less than 10 degrees, but in a corridor barely 1 meter wide. That was enough to disrupt the sequence. The first operator adjusted. The second didn't. Inside, the layout was wrong. The internal wall had been moved. A kitchen extended into what should have been open space. Appliances placed irregularly. Obstructions that didn't exist in any available plan. The team had trained for unknown interiors, but not for this level of distortion at the point of entry. The first shot came immediately, not after the breach. During it. That mattered. It meant the shooter wasn't reacting to noise. He was reacting to timing. He knew when they would enter. The round struck the wall near the second operator's shoulder, fragmenting concrete into the confined space. No direct hit, but close enough to force a break in momentum. The team didn't push forward. They hesitated. Not out of fear, out of recalculation. And in that fraction of time, the operation lost its primary advantage. Speed. The second shot was more precise. It tracked movement, not position. A correction based on the team's adjustment. That indicated something else. Observation. The suspect wasn't blind firing. He was watching the entry. But there were no cameras inside the apartment. No feeds. No external surveillance devices detected during pre-assault scans, which meant he was positioned with direct line of sight to the breach point. Exactly where they expected to dominate. Inside the command vehicle, the audio feed degraded into overlapping transmissions. Operators calling positions. Angles. One voice requesting flash deployment. Another denying it due to unknown civilian presence deeper in the structure. The Yamam commander didn't issue new orders immediately, because the situation no longer matched any predefined template. They had planned for resistance. They had not planned for anticipation. On the third attempt to push into the corridor, the team deployed a flashbang. Delayed. Too late to disorient effectively. The detonation echoed through the apartment, but the follow-up movement was cautious, fragmented. The initial rhythm was gone. They cleared the first meter, then stopped again. No further shots. No movement from inside. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had weight, because now they knew the man inside wasn't just armed. He understood them, and that changed the operation. Because Yamam could dominate space. But this wasn't about space anymore. It was about timing, and they were no longer controlling it. The problem was not the door. The problem was not the hallway. The problem was not even the shot. Those were symptoms. Surface-level disruptions in a system that had already begun to fail before the charge was ever placed. The real failure was quieter. It sat inside the assumption that this was a reactive target. Everything in the operation was built on that premise. The intelligence cycle had reinforced it. Signals intelligence showed fragmented communication patterns. Short calls. Disposable devices. No sustained network traffic. That profile suggested low coordination. Low sophistication. Human intelligence added weight to it. A local source reported weapons, not training. Presence, not capability. So the system categorized the threat. Armed suspect. Contained environment. Predictable response. And once that label was assigned, every subsequent decision aligned to it. Yamam's doctrine in urban hostage scenarios is built on controlled aggression. Speed collapses the suspect's decision-making window. Entry creates shock. Shock creates compliance. Even when it doesn't, it forces erratic behavior. And erratic behavior is easier to dominate. That model had worked. Repeatedly. But it only works under one condition. The target must be behind the timeline. This one wasn't. The first shot proved that. Not because it was accurate, but because of when it came. He fired during the breach. Not after. That meant he wasn't responding to chaos. He was operating inside it, anticipating the exact moment of entry, positioning himself not where the team was, but where they would be. That distinction mattered, because it inverted the entire engagement. Instead of reacting to Yamam's movement, he was shaping it. Inside the command vehicle, the incoming reports began to conflict. One operator described a left side angle. Another reported frontal exposure. The layout didn't match. The geometry kept shifting depending on who was speaking. That wasn't confusion. It was fragmentation. Each operator was now interpreting a different version of the same space. And that only happens when the mental model collapses. They had entered expecting a linear corridor. What they encountered was a broken structure. Walls moved. Furniture repositioned. Sightlines obstructed at irregular intervals. But those changes weren't random. They were intentional. The refrigerator blocking partial entry. The extended kitchen narrowing movement. The shifted wall creating a blind corner exactly opposite the breach point. Each element forced hesitation. Each hesitation bought time. And time, in close quarters, is control. The man inside had reconfigured the apartment not to defend it, but to delay it. That was the first realization. The second came slower, because it challenged something deeper. The intelligence hadn't just been incomplete. It had been misleading. There were no cameras, no electronic surveillance, no visible detection systems inside the apartment. Yet the shooter had timed the breach with precision that suggested awareness of external movement. So how did he know? The answer wasn't technological. It was behavioral. Yamam's approach to urban entries follows patterns. Not rigid ones, but consistent enough. Time between perimeter establishment and breach. Movement speed on stairwells. Positioning outside the door. Even the placement of charges. To an untrained observer, those patterns are invisible. To someone who has studied them, they become predictable. The suspect didn't need sensors. He needed experience. Or observation. Or both. That possibility had never been considered. Because the system didn't look for it. There was no record of prior military service. No flagged association with known militant groups. No digital footprint suggesting tactical training. So it wasn't pursued. And that created the gap. Inside the apartment, the silence after the second shot wasn't hesitation. It was discipline. He stopped firing because he didn't need to continue. Every shot had already achieved its purpose. Disrupt entry. Break momentum. Force recalculation. Now the burden shifted. From him to them. Yamam's operators were no longer executing a rehearsed sequence. They were adapting in real time to a space that resisted standard doctrine. Each step forward required confirmation. Each angle needed verification. That slowed everything. And in that slowdown, the original advantage disappeared. Speed had been their control mechanism. Without it, they were just another unit inside a confined space with incomplete information. The command structure felt it. Requests began to move upward. Permission for heavier breaching tools. Consideration of secondary entry through windows. Deployment of additional units to the roof. Each request carried delay. Each delay reinforced the same underlying issue. They didn't understand what they were facing. And without understanding, action became cautious. Caution in close quarters is not safety. It's exposure. The third realization came from something even smaller. The second shot. It hadn't been aimed at center mass. It tracked movement, then adjusted upward. A warning. Or a calibration. He wasn't trying to eliminate the first man through the door. He was measuring them. Testing response time. Reaction pattern. Spacing between operators. Collecting data in real time. That is not the behavior of an isolated suspect. That is the behavior of someone running his own operation. Inside a single apartment. Against a unit designed to end situations in seconds. The system had prepared for resistance. It had not prepared for intent. And that was the difference. Because resistance can be overwhelmed. Intent has to be understood. And at this point in the operation, they still didn't understand him. They had everything. Weapons. Training. Authority. Control of the perimeter. They still couldn't see the structure of the problem. And without that, every movement forward only made the space tighter. More dangerous. More controlled. Just not by them. They didn't replace the team. They replaced the way the team thought. The request didn't come from the stairwell. It didn't come from the man pinned behind a refrigerator that shouldn't have been there. It moved upward, through the chain of command, filtered through hesitation and incomplete reports, until it reached a level that understood something the operators inside the corridor could not yet articulate. This was no longer a breach problem. It was a behavior problem. And behavior doesn't get solved with more force. The Yamam commander didn't escalate immediately. He delayed. 30 seconds. Then another 20. Long enough for pressure to build inside the system. Long enough for multiple voices to request action that would normally be automatic. Secondary breach from the rear. Roof insertion. Gas deployment. All viable. All rejected. Because each option assumed the same thing the first plan had assumed. That the man inside would react. He wouldn't. That was now clear. So the doctrine shifted. Not publicly. Not formally. But in the decisions that followed. The forward element was ordered to hold position. Not advance. Not withdraw. Maintain pressure without committing to it. Weapons up. Angles covered. No unnecessary movement. Inside a space barely 1 meter wide, holding position is not passive. It's controlled exposure. The operators adjusted. Knees bent slightly to lower their profile. Rifle stocks tightened into shoulders slick with sweat. Breathing slowed deliberately to reduce movement noise. Every inch of that corridor became a fixed geometry problem. Outside, something else began to move. Not vehicles. Not additional assault teams. Information. Shin Bet was re-engaged, not for confirmation, but for reinterpretation. The same data set. The same fragmented signals intelligence. The same human source reporting. But now, under a different question. Not who is he, but how does he think? The answer didn't come from the data itself. It came from what was missing. No extended communication. No coordination with external actors. No attempts to escape once the perimeter was established. No signs of panic or negotiation. That absence created a profile. Self-contained. Disciplined. Comfortable inside constraint. This wasn't a man trying to survive the situation. This was a man who had prepared to control it. That realization changed the operational approach. Yamam was built for speed, but it was not limited to it. The unit's history included long-duration surveillance, undercover integration, patient tracking of targets over weeks when necessary. The difference was choice. Speed was a preference. Now it was a liability. So they removed it. The secondary containment unit repositioned. Not closer, but further down the stairwell, creating depth instead of compression. That widened the engagement space vertically, giving the forward team more flexibility without physically moving them. Above, roof access was secured quietly. No insertion, just presence. A silent variable introduced into the equation. Inside the apartment, nothing changed. And that was the point. They stopped trying to force a reaction. They started waiting for one. Time stretched. 2 minutes. Then 5. Inside a hot, narrow corridor, 5 minutes is not just duration. It's weight. Muscles begin to fatigue. Focus becomes effort instead of instinct. Small sounds amplify. Fabric shifting. Breath catching. But the operators didn't break position. Because the order was clear. Do not give him new information. That was the new doctrine. Control what he sees. Control what he hears. And most importantly, control what he expects. The earlier model had assumed that overwhelming force would collapse his decision-making. Now they understood that he wasn't making decisions under pressure. He was executing a plan. So they introduced uncertainty. The forward element reduced radio communication to minimal clicks. No verbal updates unless critical. Movement slowed to near static. Even the angle of weapon-mounted lights was adjusted to avoid consistent patterns of illumination. From inside the apartment, the environment changed. Not physically, but perceptually. The predictable rhythm of an assault was gone. No immediate follow-up after the flashbang. No aggressive push into the corridor. No verbal commands demanding surrender. Just presence. Unresolved. That creates a different kind of pressure. One that doesn't come from noise or force, but from absence. Because a prepared defender builds his plan around expected actions. When those actions don't come, the plan begins to drift. And drift creates doubt. Shin Bet fed one more piece into the system. Not confirmed. Not solid. But enough. The target had spent time in the West Bank several years prior. No official record of affiliation. But proximity to environments where Israeli entry tactics were observed repeatedly. Raids. Arrests. Night operations. Patterns. He had seen it. Maybe not as a participant, but as an observer. That was enough to learn. And that explained the apartment. The modified walls. The obstructed entry. The firing angles aligned with breach points. He hadn't built a fortress. He had built a delay mechanism against a specific type of force. And it had worked. Until now. Because the force had changed. Inside the corridor, one of the operators shifted his weight slightly. Not forward. Just enough to adjust balance. Controlled movement. Minimal. But it was the first change in minutes. Inside the apartment, there was no immediate response. No shot. No sound. That was new. Because earlier, every movement had been met with precision. Now nothing. The man inside was waiting for a pattern that no longer existed. And that was the first moment the control began to shift back. Not through aggression. Not through speed. But through restraint. Yamam hadn't become slower. They had become unpredictable. And for the first time since the breach, the man inside the apartment was no longer operating inside a system he understood. He was still armed. Still positioned. Still dangerous. But now, he was reacting to something he couldn't map. And in close quarters, uncertainty is heavier than force. Because you can aim at force. You can't aim at what you don't understand. The first move didn't come from the hallway. It came from silence breaking in the wrong place. Inside the apartment, a floorboard shifted. Subtle. Less than a second. But in an environment that had been static for nearly 7 minutes, it registered immediately. Not just as sound. As intent. The forward Yamam operator closest to the breach didn't turn his head. He didn't adjust his rifle. The movement came through his left hand, a slight tightening on the vertical grip. A signal passed backward through touch, not voice. Contact. Internal shift. No one spoke. Because sound was now information. The man inside had held discipline longer than expected. No unnecessary movement. No repositioning. He had waited for them to break first. They didn't. So he moved. Not aggressively. Not toward the breach. Laterally. The problem was geometry. From his original position, he controlled the entry point. Every attempt to push forward would expose the team to the same angle. But that control came with a limitation. It was static. Once Yamam stopped feeding that angle, it became irrelevant. So he had to change position. And the moment he did, he exposed something he hadn't before. Time. The Yamam commander didn't issue a direct order. He didn't need to. The doctrine had already shifted. Inside the corridor, the point man leaned forward by less than 5 centimeters. Not enough to trigger a shot. Enough to widen his visual slice past the refrigerator edge. Nothing. But the absence was different. The angle that had been covered before was now open. That confirmed it. He had moved deeper. The second operator rotated slightly, covering the upper left quadrant where the second shot had originated earlier. His rifle-mounted light remained off. Illumination now was a liability. Shadows worked both ways. Behind them, the third man adjusted his position to create a staggered stack, increasing lateral spacing by just enough to prevent a single line of fire from cutting through all three. Every movement was incremental, measured. They weren't advancing. They were reshaping the engagement space centimeter by centimeter. Inside the apartment, another sound. Fabric brushing against a surface. Closer now to the interior rooms. He was repositioning to a secondary defensive point, which meant one thing. He had expected them to follow. To push. To chase. They didn't. And that forced him further into his own structure. Away from the breach. Away from control. The Yamam commander finally spoke. One word. Window. It didn't refer to glass. It referred to opportunity. The secondary containment unit below began moving, but not upward. They descended one flight, then repositioned through an adjacent apartment that had been quietly cleared minutes earlier. Civilian occupants relocated without noise. No lights switched. No doors slammed. A new axis was forming. From outside the target's perception. Above, the roof team adjusted position. Still no insertion. Just weight shifting closer to the ventilation shafts that ran vertically through the building. Old construction. Poor ceiling. Sound traveled. And now, that worked in their favor. Inside the apartment, the man stopped moving. He had reached his secondary position. A bedroom. Narrower. More controlled. A single entry point. Stronger defensively. But isolated. That was the trade. The Yamam forward element didn't pursue. Instead, the first operator lowered his center of gravity and advanced one step. Slow. Deliberate. No shot came. That confirmed the distance. At least 4 meters deeper now. The second operator followed, offset to the right, covering a new angle that hadn't existed seconds before. They cleared the initial corridor. Finally. But they didn't accelerate. Speed had cost them once. It wouldn't again. The air inside the apartment was thicker. No ventilation. Heat trapped between concrete walls. Sweat ran into eyes, blurred vision momentarily, wiped away with the back of a glove without lowering the weapon. Every physical detail mattered now. Grip strength, breathing rhythm, foot placement. A misstep here wasn't noise. It was signal. They approached the doorway to the interior room. Closed. Not barricaded. Just closed. That was intentional. A visual barrier, forcing entry into a tighter fatal funnel. He wanted them to come through. The Yamam commander denied immediate breach. Another shift. Instead, the operator closest to the door moved to the side, flattening against the wall. The second mirrored on the opposite side, creating a cross angle. The third stepped back, adjusting position to cover the rear and maintain communication with the stairwell unit through minimal hand signals. Then they waited. Again. Inside the room, nothing. But this silence was different from the first. This one carried strain, because now the man inside knew something had changed. They hadn't rushed him. They hadn't followed the script. So his script was breaking. 30 seconds. 40. A minute. Then it happened. A single shot. Through the door. Not aimed. Probing. The round punched through thin wood, exiting into the corridor at chest height, but wide of any operator. A test. Looking for reaction. Looking for movement. He expected return fire. Or panic. Or repositioning. He got none. The Yamam operators didn't respond. They didn't even flinch visibly, because they had already moved off that line. The shot told them exactly where he was standing. Height. Distance. Angle. More information than they had before. Given freely. The commander spoke again. Now. The breacher stepped forward, placing a small directional charge on the door hinge, not the lock. Controlled. Minimal fragmentation. Designed to swing the door inward violently, without overpressure into the room. Placement took 2 seconds. Detonation came on the third. The door collapsed inward, not outward, breaking the expectation. At the same moment, the operator on the left entered low, almost crouched, rifle angled upward toward where the shot had originated. The second entered high, covering the opposite quadrant. A vertical split. 2 angles. Simultaneous. The man inside fired once. Late. His position had been correct. His timing wasn't. Because he had built his response on a pattern that no longer existed. The first operator's round came center mass. 2 controlled shots. 5.56 millimeter. Close range. The second operator adjusted and held fire. No additional targets. No movement. The room was small. 4 meters by 3. Bed against the wall. Window closed. Curtains drawn. No hostages. No secondary exits. The man collapsed where he stood, weapon still. In hand. An AK pattern rifle, modified with a shortened barrel. Not factory standard. Adjusted for maneuverability in confined space. He had built everything around this moment. And still he lost it. Because the system he had prepared for never arrived. The Yamam team cleared the room in under 5 seconds. Then stopped. Not from uncertainty. From confirmation. The operation was over. But the structure of what had just happened lingered in the space. Because this wasn't a victory of force. It was a correction of understanding. And it had come seconds before failure. The body didn't fall immediately. It folded. A delayed collapse. As if the structure holding it upright had been removed in stages rather than all at once. The rifle slipped from his hands, striking the floor with a dull mechanical sound that echoed briefly against the concrete walls. No one moved to secure it right away, because the room was still being read. Angles first. Corners. Ceiling line. Bed frame. Curtains. Every operator held position for an extra second longer than necessary. Not out of hesitation. Out of discipline. The kind that comes after something doesn't go the way it was supposed to. The first operator stepped forward, boot pressing lightly against the weapon, sliding it just beyond reach. The second covered the window, pulling the curtain aside with the barrel of his rifle, exposing a dark exterior. No secondary threats. No observers. The third man entered last, scanning low. Clear. The call went out over comms. Single word. Contained. Outside, the response chain activated immediately. The Yamam commander acknowledged, then relayed upward through Border Police Command. Shin Bet received confirmation seconds later. The operation status changed from active engagement to secured site. No escalation required. No additional units deployed. It ended inside that room. But the system didn't relax. The body was checked. Pulse confirmed absent. No explosive vest. No secondary devices attached to the torso. Clothing searched quickly but methodically. Pockets empty except for a small folding knife and a prepaid phone with the battery removed. That detail was noted, not as evidence, as confirmation. He had not intended to communicate during the engagement. This was always going to end here. The apartment was cleared again, slower this time. Every room, every drawer, every surface. The modified layout that had disrupted the initial entry was now studied in silence. Measurements taken. Visually. Distances recalculated. The refrigerator. The shifted wall. The door placement. None of it was random. Outside, civilians were still being held back by local police units. Some had begun recording from a distance. Phones raised. Lights flickering through windows across the street. The environment had never fully stopped being active. It had just been ignored. Now it returned. Paramedics staged nearby were called in, not for rescue, but for protocol. Time of death would be recorded. Documentation would follow. The system always closes its loops. On the roof, the containment element stood down. No words exchanged. They hadn't fired a single shot, but their position had mattered. Below, the secondary unit returned to the stairwell, retracing their movement through the cleared apartment. Quiet. Controlled. As if reversing a process that had never fully revealed itself. Inside the target room, one operator remained for a moment longer than the others. Not looking at the body, looking at the space. For meters by 3. One door. No exit. Everything about it suggested a final stand. But it hadn't been desperate. It had been calculated. That was the part that stayed. The Yamam commander entered last. No weapon raised. Just observation. His gaze moved across the same elements. The door. The angle of entry. The position where the man had stood. He didn't speak. Because there was nothing to correct anymore. The operation had succeeded. Officially, the target was neutralized. No civilian casualties. No operator fatalities. By every measurable standard, it was clean. Efficient. Controlled. But the timeline told a different story. From breach to final shot, less than 15 minutes. From first disruption to doctrinal shift, under 5. That was the margin. Not between success and failure. Between understanding and assumption. Outside, the perimeter began to loosen. Traffic resumed slowly. Civilians returned to their routines, stepping back into a street that no longer carried visible tension. But inside the apartment, the structure remained. Not the walls. The pattern. Because what happened here wasn't just an operation reaching its conclusion. It was a system correcting itself under pressure. And it had done so just before it lost control completely. What changed wasn't written into a report. It didn't need to be. Because everyone involved understood it without saying it. Yamam didn't become faster after that night. They became quieter. The official summary would record a successful counter-terror operation. High-speed response. Hostile neutralized. No civilian casualties. A controlled outcome in a dense urban environment. But that wasn't the part that stayed inside the unit. What stayed was the moment the system hesitated. Not from weakness. From misalignment. They had entered with control of the perimeter, control of the timeline, control of the authority structure. Every layer above them was synchronized. Israeli Border Police Command authorized action. Shin Bet fed intelligence. The rules of engagement were clear before the first step on the stairwell. Everything was aligned. Except the assumption. They believed they were initiating the event. They weren't. The man inside had already started it. Days earlier. Maybe weeks. Every modification inside that apartment was a decision made in advance. Every angle measured against a pattern he had observed repeatedly. He didn't need technology. He didn't need support. He only needed to understand how they worked. And for the first few seconds, he did. That was enough to break the system's rhythm. And once rhythm breaks, even the most trained unit has to rebuild it in real time. That was the lesson. Not about him. About them. After that operation, Yamam didn't rewrite doctrine in large, visible ways. There was no announcement. No structural overhaul. The unit didn't abandon speed. It remained one of the fastest urban response forces in the world. But speed stopped being the default answer. It became a tool. One option among others. Training cycles adjusted. Not in intensity, but in emphasis. More time spent on irregular environments. Civilian-modified interiors. Structures that didn't follow architectural logic. Operators trained to expect distortion at the point of entry, not after it. More importantly, they trained for absence. No immediate reaction. No predictable response. They practiced holding position inside confined spaces under elevated temperature, extended duration, without losing cognitive clarity. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 15. Not moving. Not advancing. Just controlling presence. Because that was where the system had nearly failed. Not in action. In waiting. The integration with Shin Bet shifted as well. Intelligence was no longer just about identifying targets. It became about identifying patterns of thought, behavioral indicators, exposure to prior operations, environments where Israeli tactics had been observed, even indirectly. Not who the target was connected to, But what the target had learned. That distinction changed how risk was measured. A man with no network could still be dangerous. If he understood the system. Command structures adapted in quieter ways. On-site commanders were given more flexibility to delay action without immediate pressure from higher authority. The expectation of speed remained, but it was no longer enforced at the expense of interpretation. Requests for escalation began to include a different question. Not just what do we have, but what are we missing? That question slowed things down, but it made them more precise. Inside the unit, the story of that apartment didn't become legend. It became reference. Not a failure. Not even a near failure. A correction point. Something that didn't fit the model and forced the model to adjust. Because that's how systems evolve. Not through victory. Through friction. The man inside the apartment never had control of the perimeter. He never had control of the outcome. He wasn't going to leave that room. But for a few minutes, he controlled the engagement. And that was enough to expose something deeper than tactics. It exposed the gap between power and understanding. Yamam closed that gap. Not by becoming stronger, but by becoming harder to predict. And that changed something fundamental. Because from that point forward, the system no longer assumed it was ahead. It operated as if it might already be behind. And that is a different kind of force. One that doesn't rely on speed to dominate. One that doesn't expect the enemy to react. One that understands that control is not established at the moment of entry. It is established long before that. Or not at all. They didn't win because they were faster. They won because, just in time, they stopped believing that speed was the same as control.